Ladies and gentlemen, every year there are some topics that are perhaps more topological than others, and I must say that none more so than the talk that we are about to hear. Professor Mai'a Davis-Cross is going to discuss and talk about the politics of crises in Europe and the prospects for regional peace. This is a topic that I'm sure we are all well aware of, both in the scholarly literature and not least in the ongoing political discourse in Europe, where pretty large and bold claims are frequently bandied around. And none, I believe, would be better suited to tell us about our travails in Europe than an American. Professor Mai'a Davis-Cross is well known to a Norwegian audience. She has lived and worked in Oslo at the Arena program at the University of Oslo for some years. She's currently an adjunct professor at Northwestern University in Boston. She is educated from Harvard, Princeton, where she has her PhD in politics from, and she has written numerous books, including, very appropriately, a book that came out on Cambridge University Press, I believe, called The Politics of Crises in Europe. Professor Cross, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here. It's a real honor and pleasure to be able to speak with you at the Nobel Peace Institute. And I especially appreciate that you came out in this very warm weather. So I'm delighted to have the chance today to talk to you about my forthcoming book, The Politics of Crisis in Europe. As Asla mentioned, it's coming out with Cambridge University Press in a few months. And it's a big book, but what I want to do is to try to share with you some of the highlights of the book today. I first became interested in this topic a few years ago during the height of the Eurozone crisis. I was just kind of watching all of the media coverage, all of sort of the commentary about what was happening in Europe. And of course, there was a lot of talk about the end of Europe at that point. And so I was intrigued by this because obviously in recent years, we've seen many instances where the journalists and the press are predicting the end of Europe, the demise, the disintegration of Europe, in this case, the end of the euro. So I wanted to investigate, why does this keep happening in the EU? Indeed, if we look back even further, since the inception of the EU, which of course before was the coal and steel community and the economic community, at many points since 1957, the EU has been described as being in severe crisis. One way to kind of look at this is looking at the covers of major magazines. In March 1982, The Economist featured this cover of its issue that had a tombstone, and on the tombstone was engraved the European Economic Community. So it's been many, many decades in which the death of the EU has been predicted. Nonetheless, after each of these crisis periods, the EU survives. It's still here today, and we can realize in hindsight that many of these predictions are certainly overblown. In fact, integration, or the pooling of sovereignty in Europe, has continued over time, and in some ways we could say that the EU is perhaps stronger than ever in terms of integration. In hindsight, many people often proclaim crises are opportunities for Europe. It's an opportunity to further shape European integration. If we look back to the architect of the EU, Jean Monnet, he said that people only accept change when they are faced with necessity and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. So the question that was really driving my research is, why do European crises continually defy popular and media-driven expectations? Why do they instead end up further restoring European integration? What enables this strengthening of political will and resolve to continue with the European project? So the book and my presentation today tries to explain two parts of the puzzle. One is, why do you keep having these kind of overblown predictions of doom and gloom, and then a self-fulfilling prophecy where Europe is on the verge, seemingly, of breakdown? And secondly, why do the crises then resolve with more will to continue? And I'm going to focus on three major case studies of the 21st century. One is the 2003 Iraq crisis for Europe. The second is the 2005 constitutional crisis, and the third is the 2010-12 Eurozone crisis. And as I wrap up at the end, I am going to also come back to this prospects for regional peace and sort of tell you how I would project this argument onto the current numerous and parallel crises that we see today. So first, I'm going to situate my argument a bit in the literature on crises, then kind of highlight my main argument, and then spend most of the time going into the three crises. So as a starting point, we have to define crisis, and I take John Eikenberry's definition as a starting point. He writes that a crisis is a serious threat to the basic structures or the fundamental values and norms of a social system, which under time, pressure, and highly uncertain circumstances necessitates making critical decisions. So think serious threat, need to make critical decisions. Beyond this, I'm most interested in the most severe cases of this. So I'm interested in these serious crises that actually can be thought of as threatening the very existence of the EU, or existential crisis. There's, as you can imagine, a vast literature on crises in the field of international relations. But to kind of boil it down, I would describe it as having three major perspectives. The first perspective is the so-called structural or systemic approach. And this is the argument that basically, crises are objective phenomena. Somehow problems with institutions and organizations are built into the system. So at a certain point, we can expect these problems will result in crisis. They're objective. Human perceptions don't matter. I find problem with this particular perspective because I think that human agency does play a serious role. And in particular, if we look at the historical record, there are numerous instances in which there have been crisis triggers that have not blown up into severe existential crises, so-called dogs that didn't bark. So this approach has problems with that. A second perspective is known as kind of a behavioral perspective. And this perspective looks at crises as embedded in the system, but also prioritizing the behavior of individuals. That something becomes a crisis when individuals view their preferences as sort of crossing a threshold where they lose. So individuals are maximizing their best interests, and when their best interests are harmed, this can lead to a crisis. So again, I have a little bit of trouble with this because we can't just objectively know what a loss is for an individual. We need to know what individuals value. We need to know the social processes in order to understand crisis. So the approach I'm taking is a kind of sociological perspective from the field of sociology. And this perspective says that crises are, to some extent, socially constructed and subjectively perceived. In other words, shared narratives about crises, not calculations of whether I'm losing or not, bring them into existence. Some kind of social act must define a crisis as such. And I find this approach to crisis, taking into account human interpretation, as having the most explanatory power, because it can tell us why various events become crises while others do not. And why some, moreover, build into existential proportions, whereas just remaining sort of challenges or medium-level kinds of crises. So that's kind of where the literature is and where I situate myself. So now I'm going to just kind of highlight my main argument and then apply it and look at these three major cases. So what I'm saying is there is a crisis pattern across these three major existential crises in the EU. And in fact, in the book, I actually go into more of the historical analysis and draw out a pattern even more broadly. But basically, systemic or structural flaws in Europe's institutional structure, only get us so far. I argue that we cannot fully understand them without looking at social reactions to events, the social narratives about crisis, and especially those advanced by the media. So I'm going to focus on how Europeans talk about crises and how those narratives feed into crisis resolutions. In other words, I do recognize that there are many political, economic, social challenges, social developments that are problems for Europe, But certain events, more than others, become construed as crises when people perceive them to be and define them as such. So the first part of my argument, trying to explain why we get these numerous instances of crises, draws upon sociology, as I mentioned, and I introduce this concept called integrational panic, which are periods of often overblown crises when social narratives about events build up to the extent that there is a perception the end of Europe is at hand. This notion of integrational panic really builds off of the concept of moral panic in sociology. It's a big kind of area of study in sociology that looks at how a particular type of overreaction to a perceived social problem can lead to crisis. There's a construction of social concern over an issue, and it often goes well beyond the reality of the problem. There's a perceived threat to the existing social order in these instances of moral panic. So that's my point of departure. Moral panic is a form of social panic, and I'm saying that integrational panic as well. It's not about morality, but what is happening is an overreaction to a perceived problem with EU integration. So that's the first part, and the second part of my argument tries to explain the resolution of crisis. So why EU crises tend to resolve with enhanced political will for integration. And here I borrow from psychology. Here I use the concept of catharsis to explain this process. So I argue that in the process of engaging in these serious crisis narratives, essentially European society has the opportunity to openly air and grapple with pre-existing tensions. Whether these pre-existing tensions are east-west, north-south, public elite, or other tensions you can imagine in European society, essentially the crisis becomes an opportunity to speak frankly about these problems. At the societal level, we often see these tensions in terms of identity, political culture, attitudes towards the EU. At the elite political level, it often has to do with national interests, geopolitics, especially relationships with the United States. So there are all kinds of tensions, and these crises become a chance to use language that would otherwise be considered confrontational. So if you look back at various crises and you look at the tone and tenor of how people talk about this, particularly at the elite level, you see that the pre-existing tensions shape the terms of each crisis's dominant narrative. So integrational panic is kind of the lead up and the build up of crisis. Catharsis is the resolution. And now I'm going to talk about the three most prominent examples of existential crisis in the 21st century: 2003 Iraq, 2005 constitutional crisis, and 2010-12 Eurozone. In each case, I want to emphasize that none of these crises necessarily had to threaten the existence of the EU. Each was a product of integrational panic. And I also want to emphasize that there is a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic that picks up in each of them. So first, Iraq, the Iraq crisis for Europe in 2003. The trigger for this crisis for Europe is clearly external in origin. The decision that led to the US invasion of Iraq on March 19, 2003, stemmed from a number of issues of supposed US concern. But it became specifically of European concern on September 12, 2002, when President Bush addressed the United Nations calling for an invasion of Iraq. In hindsight, most scholars, we tend to think of the Iraq crisis as a transatlantic crisis, and certainly it was. But before it was that, before it was a rift between the US and Europe, it was a serious rift within Europe. And so that's kind of what I'm focusing on. The EU's response to US actions, the US call for help in this invasion, provided the grounds for transforming this external crisis into a European one, specifically because member states did not agree on what they should do. Should they support or oppose the war? It might have ended with that. But the key thing to note, and the book actually has quite a bit of media content analysis in it, is that an international media frenzy quickly built surrounding this crisis, drawing strong connections between the EU's division over Iraq and the Iraq invasion itself. This frenzy reached a peak in February, right before the invasion, and then it gradually tapered off after that. Moreover, the nature of this media coverage during the buildup from September 2002 to February 2003 was negative in terms of its anticipated consequences for the EU's continued viability. So essentially, looking at the media coverage of this and putting something in the category of negative when the coverage says this is going to derail the European project, and something in the positive category if it's saying actually Europe is going to come through this. The analysis that I conducted shows that around 30 to 55% of the stories were negative. The EU is doomed. Only 1 to 3% were positive. The rest were neutral. So the media continued portraying Iraq as threatening the legitimacy of the EU's integration process. To give you one example, the International Herald Tribune wrote, "There has rarely been a more dramatic illustration of the Union's failure to speak with a common voice, despite the fact that it officially has a common defense and security policy. This war is undermining the course of Europe towards integration." So the international media, as it continued to pound on this story, clearly was transforming this into integrational panic. There was a growing sense that integration could not continue. As the crisis gained momentum, the perception grew that the EU's existence was threatened. And how we see this in terms of real action is that people started to question whether the impending enlargement to include the Central Eastern and European countries could continue at all. This big enlargement that was in place for so long, they talked openly about whether that could continue, and they talked openly whether even the goals of the EU and its foreign policy could move forward. The Financial Times, for example, quote, "The crisis over Iraq bears painful witness to a feeble Europe. Europe's malaise runs deeper than its failure to recalibrate and re-equip its armed forces after the Cold War. Power and prestige on the international stage are a measure of inner strength, of political self-confidence, and of economic success. Europe can claim neither." So in looking at all of this and the construction, the buildup of crisis, I argue that neither the US invasion in Iraq nor disagreement over how to deal with it in Europe really had to develop into a full-blown crisis for Europe. If you think about it, the EU had not been particularly successful at speaking with one voice in the past. The common foreign and security policy was relatively new. So why should we even expect that this should somehow result in bringing Europe together? But this constant barrage of negative coverage clearly defined this as a major crisis. As evidence of the media's powerful role, the key narrative that emerged from all this was one of East-West divide over Iraq. And here I would say, again, this is a kind of socially constructed way of characterizing Iraq. It makes sense to play this up because these were pre-existing tensions. But if we look at how the member states broke down in their views on whether or not to invade Iraq, the real dividing lines were not East-West. The Western member states were just as significantly divided among themselves as the new member states were with them. In the West, 6 member states were broadly or fully pro-war, and 9 were broadly or fully anti-war. Among the new candidate member states, 7 were broadly or fully pro-war, 3 were anti-war. So there wasn't a clear East-West blocks of division. But prior to the crisis, thinking about the impending enlargement, East-West tensions were really boiling, right? The Eastern countries were fed up with this long process of joining the EU. The Western countries were worried about the differences in worldview and how they would get along after enlargement happened. So the crisis became an opportunity to air those tensions. Of course, the media wasn't alone. I'm focusing a little bit on that, but it wasn't alone in playing up integrational panic. Certain tone-setting statements by key leaders really gave this narrative momentum. Famously, in January 2003, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld talked about old Europe and new Europe with respect to the East-West divide. French President Chirac also contributed to this, calling the EU candidate countries, quote, "not very well behaved and rather reckless," and, quote, "they had missed a great opportunity to shut up." In response, the Czech politician Lastůvka compared Chirac's remarks to Rumsfeld's naturally and complained that, quote, "such a tone is not customary in Europe." The Latvian president said, quote, "nowhere in the Copenhagen criteria does it say we cannot speak our minds." So various divisive statements made the connection between the Iraq crisis and the enlargement process, the heart of pre-existing East-West tensions. Influential commentators, as they were sort of observing all of this, talked about how the goal of a European Europe was seriously threatened by the prospects of enlargement, given that new member states would encircle Brussels with a Europe of Washington. Skipping to kind of how this all gets resolved, in May 2003, German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer says, quote, "The Iraq war is in the past. There is no point to continue discussions from yesterday." An article in a German newspaper stated, "Nobody wants to embarrass Europe in front of the world public anymore, as in the recent weeks in which the governments were insulting one another over the media." And secondly, the new resolution of the crisis would involve a new security strategy, the European Security Strategy of December 12, 2003, a major step forward in the wake of crisis that actually focus on how the EU may no longer be able to move forward at all in its common goals. Besides that advancement, in December 2003, Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida published a famous, important, tone-setting article arguing that the end of the Iraq crisis had enabled the birth of a new European identity and public sphere. So you start to see resolution resolved to continue with integration. And the question is, can we see anything about catharsis? Do the previous tensions seem to resolve going forward after they had been aired so openly and blatantly? Well, the Iraq crisis was mainly at the elite level because, as you'll recall, the public was largely, unanimous in their opposition to the Iraq war. Another reason why you might question why this had to be such an existential crisis. But clearly, this whole crisis spawned an elite-level debate in support of Europe. There was a big shift in the way that elites were talking about the common foreign and security policy, and public attitudes also shifted to the highest positive level about Europe since 1995. 56% said EU membership was a good thing, and 13% thought it was a bad thing before the crisis. After the crisis, positive feelings about EU membership were particularly high within the original 15. 85% of respondents from Luxembourg, 70% from Ireland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Spain, saying it was a good thing. The same high numbers also were reflected in perceived positive benefits of membership, increasing 6% to 53%. So you see in before and after the crisis a clear kind of sense of resolve now and a positive feeling towards the EU. Moving to the second crisis, the constitutional crisis of 2005. As you know, this treaty was basically designed to streamline the treaties in place and account for the enlarged membership. Now membership had gone from 15 to 25. Considering that the treaty was relatively modest in its aims, right, it's trying to streamline everything, especially with its regard to the impact on the public, the question emerges, why did even the possibility of a failed referenda grow into a seeming existential crisis for Europe? After all, nearly every major EU or EC treaty that had come before, except for the founding treaties, had resulted in initially negative referenda. What happened in the period leading up to the crisis is all 25 heads of state had approved the constitutional treaty. But the next stage was ratification, of course. Each member state follows its own process of ratification. But perhaps surprisingly, it was here that the crisis trigger emerged. On 20th April 2004, British Prime Minister Tony Blair unexpectedly promised a referendum, a proposal that he had previously rejected. And when he did that, 7 other member states also said they were going to hold referenda on the Constitution. So here again, like with Iraq, the crisis trigger is there. The media engages in a frenzy over the announcement of a referenda. Negative, exaggerated coverage, quickly cultivating a sense of integrational panic and the buildup of a perceived crisis. Importantly, this is happening before the referenda even were taking place. The predictions of doom and gloom, the narrative that the EU's very survival hung on this result. Nearly all media coverage predicted failure. 57 to 100% in the media content analysis shows that the prediction was a failed referenda, failed constitution, and the prospects for the EU looked bad. Only 0 to 6% of coverage was positive. And this is in stark contrast to the actual opinion polls. 73% of the Dutch and 70% of the French were in support of the constitutional treaty in the autumn of 2004. The government leaders were so confident that they weren't campaigning on the yes side. But as the frenzy developed and as the narrative of crisis built, there was clearly a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic going on. Journalists, commentators, and leaders were making the case that the EU had reached the end of the road for integration and enlargement. According to them, the EU had reached an impasse, even possibly leading to the departure of some member states. Elites also contributed to this narrative, and every time they predicted failure, the media picked it up and engaged in this kind of frenzy. And again, this is before the referendum even took place. In particular, if you look at the qualitative aspect of this narrative, the focus was on public elite tensions. And this covered a variety of issues, none of which really had to do with the constitutional treaty. But on the national level, many of the tensions involve loss of national identity and sovereignty, citizens' unhappiness with the current government, unemployment, role of migrant workers, and so on. In terms of tensions with Europe of public elite nature, feelings of remoteness of the EU, concern about the Eurozone and enlargement. Crucially, only 2% of the news coverage actually talked about what was in the Constitution itself. This, to me, really highlights the socially constructed nature of this. So clearly, when the actual referenda happens with this big buildup, the crisis height is when the French and the Dutch vote no. In the words of one former EU official, the negative referenda resulted in immediate seismic shocks to the system and represented, without a shadow of a doubt, a turning point in European integration. Those are quotes. So this, of course, solidified the sense of integrational panic. The Economist immediately embraced end of Europe rhetoric. Cover of The Economist, if I had slides, I would show all these covers, but the Europe that died was on the cover of June 2005. Inside, they wrote, the EU should move in the direction of being a looser, less federalist, and decentralized club. The club must pass more powers back to its members. Cover of Time magazine, the great crack-up. Cover of Der Spiegel, dictatorship of the bureaucrats. The public elite tensions were played up throughout. But again, the Constitution did not fail because anything inherent about its terms, nor did it fail because of widespread agreement that more Europe was a bad thing. Looking at opinion polls and studies of the French case, 55% voted no. There was a scandal involving the finance minister. Unemployment had reached 10%. People thought the 35-hour work week was in jeopardy. They were voting about issues like this. In the Dutch case, 62% voted no. The people were concerned that the treaty meant Turkey would join the EU. The treaty said nothing about Turkey. Some no longer liked the euro, but the euro wasn't at stake in the treaty. As one expert puts it, quote, few, if any, of the electorate could indicate with any degree of precision the precise way in which the Constitution itself caused, contributed to, or aggravated any of these phenomena. These negative referenda need not necessarily have been defined as an existential crisis for the EU. Again, as I mentioned, literally nearly every previous treaty had resulted in initially negative referenda. Moving to the resolution of this crisis, several commentators and scholars observed the emergence of a new European public sphere. There's a lot of evidence kind of describing the ways in which people were debating political issues across borders. In a way, the fact that the treaty failed and they left it was the democratic process at work, right? People have a right to voice their opinion on treaties. But then the Reform Treaty was put into place, and later it changed its name to the Lisbon Treaty, was signed into being, and this too did represent big steps forward for integration. You have the EU foreign minister, the diplomatic service, the 140 embassies around the world, and so on. But I would focus more on really what it did to the political sphere at the societal level in terms of integration. Nonetheless, overall, the EU comes out of this crisis more integrated than ever. The tensions that characterize the divide between the elites and the general citizenry became less prominent. It's not that these tensions go away, but they're less prominent. So looking at the question of catharsis, if we look at the Netherlands, which voted no, in spring 2004, only 36% were satisfied with the EU. This rose to 47% 2 years later, and then increased further to 53%, the same year the Lisbon Treaty came into effect. If we look at France, public views on whether the EU membership is a good thing started at 43% in spring 2004, rose to 60% in autumn 2007. So in effect, you see this airing of the tensions, the public elite tensions, and the pre- and post-crisis opinion polls demonstrate a kind of increase in citizens' feelings about the EU. The last crisis, the Eurozone crisis of 2010-12. What triggered this crisis? Again, there's a lot of debate surrounding the origins, particularly for something like this, economic, financial, and so on. But nearly every explanation is structural in some way. Scholars and experts have recognized, though, that this was a crisis of confidence. But there's little understanding of the process by which the confidence was lost. Clearly, the subprime mortgage crisis that brought down Wall Street in 2008 was an early external cause for what would be the Eurozone crisis. Some would argue that the Eurozone was headed for crisis no matter what. But it's important to recognize that it took a massive destabilization of the entire global economy caused by American deregulation under President Bush and prior administrations for the weaknesses in the structure of the Eurozone to rise to the surface. There was clearly a real problem, a real solvency problem with Greece. But the weaknesses in the Eurozone were in some way or other caused by a lack of full integration that was gradually being achieved. Perhaps not quickly enough, but it was hard to imagine just how severe these issues on Wall Street were, that they were brewing and that they were about to explode. So, looking at the Eurozone in the period up since Europeans adopted the euro to the period where the crisis happened, the euro was doing quite well. It had a steady growth rate. It maintained this steady growth rate. It was comparable to the United States in that growth rate. It took around 2 years for the Wall Street crash to really be interpreted as a full-blown existential crisis for the EU and its currency. Growth did contract as it did everywhere in the world in 2009, but it wasn't really till 2011 that this became interpreted as a serious problem for the euro. And so the more immediate trigger, besides this kind of several years ago external trigger, the more immediate trigger for this particular crisis was the perception that Eurozone problems would not be confined to Greece. In May 2011, looking at the media, integrational panic clearly began to take root. This was when Portugal, it was determined, would require a bailout, and the possibility that Greek default meant a second bailout for Greece would be necessary. But still, even here, at this point, we're only talking about 3 to 4% of the whole Eurozone economy. Greece was only about 2%, Portugal, even a smaller percentage. Nonetheless, the narrative shifted from the debate about what to do to help Greece to fears that the European project itself was in jeopardy. So then the question is, why did the Greek debt crisis turn into a full-blown existential crisis for the EU, complete with end-of-Europe rhetoric? Well, there's this media frenzy, specifically between May and October 2011, a very sharp spike in the nature of the quantity of the coverage. We're talking about thousands of additional news stories on this particular crisis. The socially constructed dynamic, I think, in economic crises are particularly hard felt because markets are fundamentally shaped by perceptions, and investors, speculators, need to have confidence in the economy. So while certainly, yes, the Eurozone did have some elements of weaknesses, I would say all economies do, but it was really the shift in perception amplified by the media that constructed the feeling of European-wide crisis. And this caused markets to react sharply against the future prosperity of the Eurozone. Journalists played a significant role. Investors started betting against other countries in the Eurozone that weren't part of the Greece-Portugal problem. 57 to 78% of coverage predicted that the euro would be gone. Only 3 to 7% predicted that it would stay. The covers of The Economist were particularly striking. One in 2010 said, "Acropolis now, Europe's debt crisis spins out of control." There's a picture of Angela Merkel and then a quote saying, "The horror, the horror." And then you have 2011, the euro crisis, time for plan B. Here you see European leaders rowing their boat over the cliff. A couple months later, On the Edge, another cover of The Economist, why the euro crisis has just gotten a lot worse. And here you see a euro coin balanced on the edge of the cliff. And then finally, a few months after that, November 2011, is this really the end? And here the euro coin is going down in flames on a diagonal on the cover of The Economist. So most elite public figures didn't recognize this ratcheting up of the crisis rhetoric, but there was a small group of former leaders who spoke out about this. Former British Foreign Secretary Miliband wrote in an op-ed, quote, "I don't know whether to weep or laugh. Eurozone leaders have turned a 50 billion euro Greek solvency problem into a 1 trillion euro existential crisis for the European Union." Former French President d'Estaing said in a speech, "Greece is a great culture, but a small country in our financial sphere, and there is no basis for it rocking the euro at this point, had it not been constantly prodded by speculators and by banks from outside the euro area." Former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt added to this. He said, "The talk of a crisis of the euro is merely hot air emanated by journalists and politicians." By contrast to all of this, media reports are writing stories like "It's time to admit the euro has failed" and 10 reasons the euro was a dumb idea. So in this period of crisis buildup, I would say that integrational panic reached its height in November 2011. This is when Greek Prime Minister Papandreou announced that he would put austerity to a popular referendum. The socially constructed nature of this crisis is apparent when you consider at this point in time in the crisis, at no point did a European Commission official or any EU head of state suggest that Greece or any other country would have to leave the EU. So the tensions that were played up in this narrative were clearly the north-south divide, differences between northern and southern member states. And really, these were pre-existing tensions. Before the crisis had even grown, there was a language of stereotypes that was becoming ever more severe. This kind of stereotype that northern Europeans were assumed to be hardworking, law-abiding people who live within their means, and the stereotype of southern Europeans, work-shy, rule-bending, and profligate. Even though there was little reality to these stereotypes, it was becoming more and more tense. And the largest portion of this coverage was focused on these particular tensions. I would say it didn't necessarily have to be that way. Why not focus on Wall Street and the US being so irresponsible, or on speculators, or on rating agencies, or other kinds of tensions between Brussels and the member states? But the biggest portion of this narrative was the pre-existing north-south differences and biases. At various points in the crisis, the backlash became so severe, especially in the southern member states, that there was open talk of the so-called German problem again. Various highly controversial forms of German bashing. Op-ed columnist Gideon Rockman wrote, quote, "Any taboos about references to the Nazi occupation of Greece have been dropped long ago." Around half of the coverage focused on Germany being too iron-fisted. And perhaps this is a bit surprising because the shift for the blame on the crisis goes from the South, where there is more of an issue, to the German economy, which wasn't actually suffering directly in light of the crisis, nor were they actually destabilizing the euro. But the narrative had built into the crisis is Germany doesn't want to help those in the South. Moving to the resolution of this particular crisis, it was not until Mario Draghi, head of the ECB, said in London in mid-2012 to an audience of business leaders that he would do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, quote, and, quote, "Believe me, it will be enough." The markets finally calmed down. By early 2012, the end of Europe rhetoric had all but disappeared. There was a brief resurgence of the crisis narrative in June 2012, with concerns about Italy and Spain. But nonetheless, we cannot ignore the progress that came in terms of EU integration in the wake of this crisis. Beforehand, it would have been impossible to talk about things like Eurobonds or a European finance minister. While these things weren't agreed to, maybe they were certainly put on the table. You couldn't even say fiscal union before without causing deep alarm. But Europe now has a fiscal compact, new transparency laws that allow Brussels to kind of interact directly with member states. The Commission can send inspectors to financially troubled capitals. There's a permanent European stability mechanism, creation of banking union, and the eventual creation of fiscal union. So there is this resolve to continue and to keep the euro. Was the airing of north-south tensions helpful in diminishing the pre-existing tensions that existed between North and South. The Eurobarometer surveys do show that there is a strong movement towards convergence in the views of the northern versus the southern member states, pre versus post-crisis. After the crisis in 2013, there's strong evidence that there's this newfound kind of common view. So just to cite a couple of statistics, in 2008, 52.6% in the South thought that economic decisions should be made jointly between the member states and the EU. The North responded with 38.5%. So the numbers are low, but also there's a difference between the South and the North. The South wants more kind of closer working together on the EU and financial issues. In 2013, if we skip ahead, a similar question was asked. 91.2% of agreement from southern member states and 88% of agreement from northern member states that EU member states should work more closely together. So not only do you see a jump in the numbers, but you see a convergence, a similarity between the North and the South. So to conclude, what do these three cases of crisis tell us? What does this mean for the prospects of regional peace today? I've argued that we can't fully understand the crisis the pattern of crises and the severity of them without looking at the socially constructed dynamic of them. I've argued that the international media is a prominent societal actor. It plays a significant role, but so do elites and others. They engage in negative spin and narrative construction. The tensions, though, embodied in these narratives do not really necessarily reflect the core problems of the crises, showing that this becomes an opportunity to kind of air these pre-existing tensions. Additionally, I think this shows that elites are often weak in their response to these challenges. These various events do not necessarily have to develop into full-blown crises. There are challenges, of course, there are problems to deal with, but do they need to take Europe to the brink every time? The dominant narratives of these crises were not necessarily the only way to talk about these crises. So it seems to me that the EU is too often a victim of these negative predictions, these media frenzies, and it tends to come out of them with renewed consensus. So I would not suggest necessarily that the EU should embrace or encourage sort of existential crises to happen. The danger of self-fulfilling prophecies is far too great, particularly when we're talking about financial crises. The austerity response in particular really sort of took on a self-fulfilling dynamic. But overall, despite the need to kind of improve and deal with these crises better, the prospects for regional peace, I would say, actually look quite good. The EU has proven time and time again it is resilient in the face of these crises. It does currently face a new round, several crises at once. There are implications in these crises beyond just the EU, but the greater region: migrant flows, terrorist threats, Brexit, Russian aggression, and so on. In looking at these crises, though, I would say, in comparison to the three I've just discussed, we haven't really seen them reach the level of existential crisis. We haven't really seen a takeoff in terms of integrational panic. The media coverage has been relatively stable. It doesn't mean that Europe is out of the woods, that none of these things are going to really turn into something that could threaten Europe or seemingly threaten Europe. If we consider Brexit as somewhat similar to the constitutional crisis, for example, because there's a referendum, there's not been an overblown sense of doom and gloom in the negative prospects. Most of the coverage has actually said the UK will probably remain. In the case of migration, terrorism, and Russian aggression, these are all sort of external to the EU, not unlike perhaps the Iraq crisis case, but there's no talk of the breakup of the EU over differences involving these issues. The migrant crisis perhaps has the greatest potential to grow into something that might be seen as an existential threat, mainly in terms of how the far-right parties are becoming empowered across Europe. But still, that isn't really giving us a sense that it's able to destabilize Europe as a whole. So there's many explanations that you could sort of draw out of this. Perhaps the media is distracted with the Trump-Hillary presidential election, and so they're more interested in focusing on this. Perhaps, the Eurozone crisis, which was relatively recent, aired many of the pre-existing tensions, so they're not so severe and rumbling under the surface at this point. In the end, I think it's important to remember, in considering all of these major crises, that it doesn't have to be the case that the EU moves forward with integration. There's nothing really stopping the EU from rolling back integration or even breaking up. It is a possibility. But there would have to be the will to do so. And time again, Europe becomes stronger in the wake of crises. The 1986 Single European Act, 2003 Security Strategy, 2009 Lisbon, 2011 Fiscal Compact, among many others, all followed seemingly serious existential crisis. I think there's a strong sense of loyalty to the project that journalists and opinion makers often don't understand. So this kind of cliche that crises create opportunities, hopefully I've done some good in trying to convince you that there is more importance and meaning than the cliche actually implies, that this actually does kind of work in practice in a way that seems to strengthen Europe over time, and we'll see if that continues to be the case. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Professor Davies-Cross, thank you very much for some thought-provoking and, in some ways also provoking thoughts. We will now take a 10-minute recess and then re-adjourn for questions and answers. Thank you very much. I guess it's the man who holds the mic who can ask the first question. Professor Davies-Cross, thank you very much for a stimulating talk. And I think we can all agree that you're right when you describe the European integration project as being in perpetual crisis, and that the EU has been able to muddle through all the crises of the past. That said, it seems that the current set of crises are quantitatively and qualitatively different than the ones you discussed in your talk. In current Europe, we see that the crisis of 2008 is still lingering. European economies have been flatlining since 2008, the longest period of stagnation, some say since the Great Depression, but certainly since the 1970s. And at the same time, we see a major power in the EU seriously considering abandoning the project altogether, combined with the collapse of two-party government in many European countries. And we also see the migration crisis that has, dispelled the notion to many Europeans of being the winners of globalization, that globalization also has a negative side to it. And I was wondering, Christopher Bickerton of Cambridge University was recently quoted in the Daily Telegraph using an image of the cartoon character that's run off a cliff and keeps on running until realizing that he's in thin air and then just plummeting to the ground. And this was an image that he was using for the EU. Do you think in the current climate, based on your research, will the integration project be able to escape this set of crises stronger and more integrated, or will some, or indeed all, of the elements that constitute the European Union shake loose and fall off? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. When I look at today's setting, though, I don't find it that unprecedented, actually, because if we look historically to the period of the 1970s through mid-1980s in the EU, we also have a kind of similar situation multiple crises at once, a period that historians all refer to as one of Euro-pessimism and Eurosclerosis. And the problems were quite severe at the time, multiple oil shocks, the failure of the early snake system or monetary system of the EU, several countries in Europe reverting back away from democracy, very, very slow integration, if at all, during that entire period. The French vetoing British membership. So there were a number of major crises, both external and internal to Europe, that the EU had to tackle at once. And this is the period where, as I mentioned, the economists put a tombstone of the European Economic Community on the cover. So, we can debate to what extent they're exactly as scary as each other, but I do think that there's a lot of talk about the unprecedented nature of parallel crises right now, and I think we can actually draw a comparison to this earlier period. One thing I would say, though, about the current situation, and for that matter, the 70s and 80s, is that it hasn't reached the point of existential crisis yet. So my theory is predicting, when it's a widespread perception that the end of Europe is near, this kind of taking Europe to the brink is something that tends to trigger a deep kind of soul searching. Do we really want to get rid of Europe or not? And that's a kind of special kind of really ratcheting up of thinking on the prospects for Europe, and really all or nothing kind of thinking. But with the current set, it's not yet existential. I don't really see if the British leave the EU, there's already been quite a bit of talk of, well, maybe it won't, really affect the rest of the member states that much because the British were dragging down the process of integration. Maybe the rest of Europe can move forward more quickly. Or the referendum goes negative, but they muddle through in some different way, grant concessions to the British. No one really wants the British to leave, and if they can find some way to appease them, they might. The migration crisis is already seemingly less severe than before. The terrorism, the terrorist attacks have really sparked so many different areas of increased intelligence sharing, new policies, diplomatic interactions, just a flurry of different policies that advance integration in a way that, you could say, well, maybe it's a reaction to crisis, as I've tried to describe, but maybe it's also the functioning of the European kind of system, which involves muddling through, as you described, but also democracy. So a lot of people look at the debates in Brussels, especially during the Eurozone and during the migration issue, and they say European governance is dysfunctional. Look at how bad Europe operates, right? But is it really dysfunctional, or is this democracy at work? And even more so, is this 28 democracies at work? I mean, in a sense, it's quite impressive that these debates can happen. They show that there is a respect for dialogue. If they can't resolve an issue in the first meeting, they have another meeting. If they can't do it, they schedule another summit. So you have rounds and rounds of summits that some, especially the media, will interpret as dysfunctional. But in another way, it is a normal process of democracy. So, I think Chris Bickerton's assessment is exaggerated and sort of designed to go with this kind of new intergovernmentalism argument he's developed more on the scholarly side of things. I don't think, as I ended my talk, anything could happen. You could have a self-fulfilling prophecy where Europe does fall apart. Hopefully that would reflect political will and not just some sort of unconscious tragedy. But as far as I can tell, the way that the EU is working, even with these parallel crises, is pretty much business as usual. Each crisis on its own is not as severe as the three that I've described, and there is a path out of all of them in some respect. And even together, nothing is really being discussed in existential terms. So looking at, again, opinion polls, as I mentioned during the break, is also crucial. Very, very consistently, Europeans in all member states, I think, for the UK, except for the UK, opinion polls show that citizens trust EU institutions more than their national institutions, than their domestic institutions. This is consistent. There's a pretty wide gap between that level of trust. They trust EU institutions more. When you ask them, do they want the EU? Yes, they want the EU. There's another distinction to make as well in terms of what citizens want. You can be critical of the EU, but still want the EU. The Greeks, during the height of the crisis there, of the Eurozone crisis, the majority were critical of the EU. They didn't like the austerity, they didn't like all of the hardships and problems they were facing, but even bigger majority wanted to stay in the EU and wanted to keep the euro. So I think we also have to distinguish these kind of finer-tuned nuances in thinking about what's possible going forward, what do Europeans really want. Criticism, things that look like dysfunction but are actually debate, are healthy things in democracies. So I'm a little less skeptical until I see evidence that things are really sort of reaching the point of no return. I don't see why we should assume that this period is somehow special and different compared to previous challenges and obstacles for Europe.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I was just wondering, when you were talking about how the kind of the former policymakers kind of engage with the media, I was wondering, do we know anything about how what publications influence the EU and the Commission? What publications do they read? Is it The Economist or is it more national outlets?
Great. Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't have time in my presentation to go through all of the methodology, but I mentioned that I did do this media content analysis. And from what I looked at in terms of readership, it is true that the biggest readership among Europeans are these kind of Anglo-American publications. They do read other types of publications nationally, of course, as well. But the four that I looked at based on sort of highest readership are The Economist, Time Magazine, International Herald Tribune, and Financial Times. So yes, these are English language media, but I would say there's two effects here. One is that a lot of EU leaders are reading them, and Europeans in general are reading them, but also they tend to have their arguments kind of filter down into the national publications. So that was the quantitative side of my analysis when I threw the percentages out. But the book also goes into the national and local kinds of publications as well. So yeah, I think that people get influence from multiple kinds of sources. The elites that you referenced are in a special position because they're reading these publications, but they're also talking to the media. So when they say something, they become those publications in effect, right? They're quoted, maybe they're misquoted, maybe what they're saying is taken out of proportion, or maybe it's reported accurately. But this is why it's important not just to focus on media, but also elite narratives and how these filter down in different directions.
Thank you. Jarle Simensen, History University. Thank you for an excellently arranged lecture, mildly optimistic, and I hope realistic. This is not my field, but I take it that academic literature on EU is in general more optimistic, realistic than the media. I might like to ask, do you see any tendency when you compare European to American researchers? Are Americans more optimistic observers? Or does more of European academic literature spring out of the anti-EU milieus? My second question is, have you seen in the media or in academic research any analysis of the concrete scenarios of how this thing is going to break up? I mean, it's a huge thing. There's a large institutional momentum in it all. We can only mention the euro. precisely how is this can this be thought to break up, and over what period of time, etc.? You don't have to go into future research, but with such strong statements, especially from academic observers, one might expect an answer to at least some of those questions. Thank you.
Those are very interesting questions. And I'm happy to try to address them, especially the first one. I think maybe my answer might surprise you a little bit. In sort of part A of your first question, you asked about whether sort of the academic literature versus the media, optimistic versus pessimistic. I think clearly the academic literature tends to be more optimistic than the media. And this sort of came through in my remarks earlier. Essentially, the media doesn't understand the EU for the most part. There's a kind of tendency to ignore the loyalty that is there, the fact that this is a political project as well, that it's not just a trading bloc where states are in it for their own economic self-interest, and the minute something doesn't suit them, they leave. This isn't how the EU works. There's a long history to it that really originates in security reasons and originates in the very outcome of the EU getting the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. That is the political project of Europe. So I think clearly the media tends to always be pessimistic, bad news sells. If we look at part B of your first question, EU versus US researchers and tendency to be optimistic or pessimistic, I would say from my experience, EU researchers are more, or European-based researchers are more optimistic than American-based researchers. I often get this kind of comment that, oh, you're just optimistic because you're American. I'm not sure what that means. Are the American people like an optimistic people, or I don't know what that means. But from what the discussions I've had in the US, based in Boston, Americans tend to kind of conform to media analysis. They tend to buy what the media is saying about the EU, which, as I said, is pessimistic. So there's a widespread perception in US academia that the EU is done, that it has few prospects, that the migration crisis is exclusively the problem of the EU, not the Middle East, but the EU, that everything is going wrong. This is a dysfunctional entity. Why did the Europeans create the EU? It's widespread. It's very pessimistic among US researchers. As far as your second question is concerned, scenarios of how the EU would break up. Since in academia we're supposed to focus more on explaining what has happened and what is happening, this is pretty rare, but I will note one example of when I sat through a conference precisely geared toward explaining how the EU was going to break up. And this was at the height of the Eurozone crisis at the University of Chicago. Everyone in the room was an economist except for me. And so I gave a similar presentation as I just gave now, and the economists were completely opposed to this argument because they said markets have nothing to do with perception. It's, this is the Chicago School of Economics, that markets are just, these kind of perfectly calculating structures that basically act, and there's no real human input into them. So they did actually come up to the board with their models and explained how the euro was going to go away. And I'm sitting there thinking the euro is not going to go away, but how interesting that you've all mapped it out and spent all this time with your economic models explaining what is going to happen. I mean, because to me, and this again goes back to your first question, American academics pessimistic about Europe, so they were quite sure. And I think for a short time, I was at a conference in Atlanta recently. There was a panel saying how the Schengen system is done. This was right after the Paris attacks. So there was some kind of contemplation of how will you end Schengen? Well, you'll just basically put up borders and Schengen will be done. It was not about the whole breakup of the EU. But I guess this does happen occasionally. I don't think there's much value in it because it is a bit unrealistic. I mean, you could actually lose the euro without the EU breaking up. So It's a little too speculative, I think, for it to be kind of a cottage industry in academia.
I'm Olav Njølstad, historian and director of this institute. I also liked your talk very much, very interesting. I think I learned more about what triggered these crises and the role of the press in the build-up of the crisis than actually about how the crises were solved and why. But I guess in your book, which you said is a big book,
Yeah.
there's also space dealing with that. The picture you give us is kind of bleak. I mean, within a decade, 3 what you call existential crises. And that may give us an impression of a very crisis-ridden phenomenon, institution. Another way to look at it, however, is that this reflects that what we are dealing with is a rather young, new phenomenon. It's a young institution. And I think if you look at it in historical perspective, we will see that many organizations, institutions will be ridden by crisis in the early phase. And then many questions will be settled and sorted out, and the frequency of crisis will not be as high as in the early phase. That again probably has less to do with age or aging in itself, but to take an optimistic perspective, it has probably something to do with learning. And that is an aspect of crisis that you didn't really deal with. But in much of the crisis literature, you will see that what you call the catharsis usually also will, to really become catharsis, there will be an element of learning. Assessment, but also learning. So my question to you is, do you see any examples in these three cases of institutional learning? And will that learning process help the EU to deal with future crises in a better way? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective to take on. I agree with you that absolutely the EU is a work in progress and it's relatively young. And when you see these crises, one of the main reasons they become so sort of thought-provoking for elites and the public is because they have to kind of figure out a way to create new policies, that policies didn't exist. If they had already had something in place like a fiscal union, it would be easier to just say, well, this doesn't have to be a crisis trigger because we already know what to do in a situation like this. So I think that this is part of the growing pains of the EU, and once you have a common asylum policy, for example, then the next time there is a big migration flow, that should kick in automatically, and that should be sort of the taken for granted method of kind of dealing with it. So while I haven't actually grappled with the concept of learning in the book, in the conclusion chapter, I do try to put them all together rather than just comparing the crises, to look at the overall trajectory. And I would say that absolutely, I think that there is a learning process that goes on. I don't think that it's satisfactory enough. And this is kind of what I ended with in my talk, is that, I think European leaders could do a lot more to grapple with these crises, to explain Europe better when they have these continuous summits to try to kind of wrangle out some kind of agreement on the way forward. When Draghi said, I will do whatever it takes to save the euro, and believe me, it would be enough, it worked. So my question is, why not learn from the kind of counter-narrative, the potential in the counter-narrative to not allow the EU to go so far to the brink like this every single time? Your idea of learning is precisely what could be brought into this narrative. We as Europeans are learning, a leader could say, in sort of the throes of these crises, that this is a policy area that we are actively solving, and we will solve it, could be part of that narrative of learning. So I think, when I talk about the progressive steps towards more and more integration, that in effect is the policy learning process. It's about resolving the crisis through a new phase in the EU's development. When you have a crisis that involves a new European security strategy, for example, that is something that allows Europe to have some mechanisms to deal with future foreign policy challenges. But that's a different type of learning than I think the learning you're talking about, or that I'm sort of describing, which I think is really the core thing. It is about being able to give the EU, in a sense, stronger self-esteem in a way, to be able to respond and not just kind of be the victim of these repeated crises. Because at a certain point, it could actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it would be a shame, I think. I mean, the EU is the greatest example of cooperation that has led to peace in the international system, and I think people often forget that. So playing with fire in the way that they tend to do is something that requires learning to get out of. But on the policy level, I see great success with the learning of crafting new policies, finding agreements that will get them out of the crisis and resolve it.
Geir Lundestad. Yes, I want to join those who have praised your presentation. It was very clear. And we historians, we often have doubts when the historical examples are outlined, but I thought you outlined your three cases in a very clear and satisfactory way. I have certain questions about the nature of your overall argument. Although I must confess that it's, when you haven't read this, it's very difficult to be very explicit on this, because your argument is very carefully phrased, and you may miss many things when you just hear it presented orally. But the way I understood this, you had your introduction, and I listened very carefully when you described the overall theoretical approach, and you said that you wanted to discuss existential crisis. Most of the specific references to existential, they were from the literature. They talk about existential crisis all the time because they exaggerate the nature of the crisis. But I may be wrong, but I thought you yourself also in that first part, and in part also in describing the three crises, you accepted or you used the term existential crisis. But then, in the explanation, your main explanation, the way I understood it, was that they weren't really existential. This is how they were overcome. They were not existential. So I wonder in the book if there is some tension there, or whether this just a misperception on my part. I mean, the overall argument is the one we all make. I mean, I have made this argument, and many others have made the same argument about Atlantic relations. I mean, I've edited 2 books. I will just mention the titles. No End to Alliance. You see? Same argument. No End to Alliance. And the second book, Just Another Major Crisis. Because there are many major crises. They come and go all the time. And then they are overcome. And then we describe them as not existential. Sometimes I wonder what an existential crisis is. What are the requirements? Because most of us have a very strong tendency to downplay these crises, and we always, as you do all the time, compare with history, which is both right and wrong. We should compare with previous episodes in history, but history never repeats itself. Never. History rhymes occasionally, but we are never told. I think this is the weakness of the kind of argument you're making, and the kind of argument I'm also making, that these are just repetitions of history. Well, yeah, there may be a general side to that, but there will always be a very specific side. Exactly how serious was it? And what distinguished this from other crises? True, none of them were existential, but they were different. Short second point, you believe very strongly in the EU, and so do I in a way. We should turn it all around and argue like you do, that the EU has been over time been remarkably successful. But I read Thomas Risse's book because I wanted to find out, of some years ago, I wanted to find out exactly how integrated the EU was. And you assume, like most of us, that it's quite integrated. He wants to prove that there is a European identity and a European common discussion. I must say, when I read his book, I became quite convinced that he was absolutely wrong. Because it shows that, true, in many European countries, there is indeed a European identity. But in every country in this category, there is an even stronger national identity. The European identity comes in second, after the European identity. And we even have some members, not only Britain, but primarily Britain, where they have no European identity. Which of course tells you something about what could happen. And of course, when he refers to, I was not entirely convinced by the 4 newspapers you used. You would wonder, I think most Europeans would wonder about Le Monde and Frankfurter Allgemeine or whatever. Thomas Risse, he talks about Le Monde and Frankfurter Allgemeine. But I think what is wrong with this argument is that if you want to talk about the public level, the tabloids and television are vastly more important. These are all elite papers. So I think we miss a few things there. But a very good presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be quick because I know we're out of time. But okay, so this existential point that you started with, the point of my approach is to say when something is perceived to be an existential crisis. So this is why I'm taking a perspective that recognizes the importance of socially constructed crises. If I were asked, objectively, should this be an existential crisis? Are the ingredients there for an existential crisis? I would say no. But at a certain point, it doesn't matter what I say, because if people think that it is, if they're actually toying with the idea of the EU breaking apart, then it is an existential crisis. That is how I define it. It's more severe than just a crisis. It's something where the prospect of ending the EU is on the table, and then it's overcome. And I've read your Atlantic crisis. It appears, it's cited heavily in my Iraq chapter. So yes, I think that, the point is that history never repeats itself, but as political scientists, we try to identify patterns, specifically to learn from these patterns. So I'm essentially combining crises that would seem to be quite different in nature and in origins, but at the same time allow us to see that there is a way in which European society and elites tend to respond to these triggers. And shouldn't we be aware of that? because that actually can introduce some interesting policy prescription. As far as Ries's book is concerned, yes, I mean, I think the EU is integrated. I fundamentally think that it involves an identity component. His argument is that there's a Europeanization of national identity. So everyone can have different pathways to embracing an EU identity if they want. He finds that over 50% do. But just because you have a national identity first and a European identity second doesn't mean it's not a European identity. And as we've discussed, I think, in other fora, really it's not even that simple, because most people have stronger local identities and regional identities than they do national identities. So it's never the case of, are you Spanish or are you European? Because people really identify in very different and nuanced ways with localities and regions, and they build their identities upon that. If Europe is that final layer of identity, that's interesting. That's significant, I think. The quantitative analysis of the book is focused on those four. And of course, they are of a particular character. They're international, they're English language. But I really do go into a lot of the local coverage and look at Le Monde and German presses and others as well. In fact, there's an interesting story where Le Monde had basically published an economic thriller in 12 pieces over the weekend. And the economic thriller predicted the end of the euro. It was actually called the end of the euro. A British tabloid saw this and they thought, this is actual news. So the British tabloid actually published this work saying 2 major banks in France are about to fail. Copying from the economic thriller, a fake story. The markets then responded, and shares in the biggest bank in France declined by 15%. So you can imagine the shock and horror after the weekend when the French leaders came back to work, and they're like, how did this happen? You've just created a monster out of thin air. You've just reported that the French banks are failing and nothing has actually happened. So again, we can see these stories, and I certainly try to bring to life all of these other levels of publications and what's going on in them. But in order to get a kind of snapshot of the media frenzy, I initially rely on sort of the 4 big ones and then kind of go from there. But thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think I may have spoken a little bit out of turn at the beginning of the seminar, saying that this is the most topological talk of our spring lecture series, because next week, this coming Thursday, Aisha Sarakol from the University of Cambridge is going to talk about how the Muslim world learned to live with the West. Lessons for today, and I think that is another topic that I think will attract wide attention. I hope to see you all then. For now, thank you very much.